Greetings. My name's James Mast, and I'm a member at Methacton Mennonite Church, which is part of Mosaic Mennonite Conference. I've worked as a professional therapist for nearly 13 years. 10 of those were part of the CRM Penn Foundation. I'm also an adjunct professor at Eastern University. I'm a husband and a dad, and although not all those things define me as a person, at least it lets you know a little more about me and my perspective on things for this December's discussion. And this December's Salt and Light theme is power and vulnerability. And the first story that I was asked to take a look at is a story from the book of Judges. And for me, it's a story that really illustrates the brutality of the time of some of the stories of the Old Testament. Basically, after Gideon, who was one of these well-respected leaders of God's people, dies, there's a power vacuum, as there often is when highly influential leaders die in those times. And a similar thing happened after Alexander the Great died. Violence broke out as leaders vied over power. After Gideon's death, the question for God's people became, who's going to lead us? And it is in that space of chaos and uncertainty that Abimelech seizes authority through power. And not just any type of power, he uses his family name to convince others to give him money, which he essentially uses to hire a bunch of hitmen. And then he uses those hitmen to murder his way to the crown. And these people he murders are his relatives, 70 of his half-brothers to be precise. And there is a chilling reference by the method by which they're killed. And all in the same stone is what it says. The image gives me kind of the shivers. I mean, it's like brutal, Game of Thrones brutal. And if you don't know that reference, that's probably a good thing, because Game of Thrones was pretty disturbing as a show. And in the end, things don't work out for Abimelech. He gets killed in battle, and Jotham, who's the only one of his brothers to survive Abimelech's purge, goes on to be a more positive leader. Now, there's a lot in this story, and naturally in hearing it, our minds will be moved in different ways. I think sometimes the best thing I can do as a discussion leader is to begin a meeting with an open opener. Meaning, after everyone has taken in the story of Abimelech and Jotham, I'd invite people to share what came up for them. For me, in the beginning of a meeting, I don't like to narrow people's brain activity by specifying what should be shared or how it should be shared. I might say things like, share what came up for you related to power in this story, if I was trying to narrow things. But oftentimes, instead of that, as an open opener, I'll ask, what bubbled up to you after you heard this? Or what was your own reactions to this? What's percolating other than the coffee, you might say? It's important to give people time to respond. And if you struggle with waiting in silence, I find it helpful to count to 15 in my head before saying anything else. And when you say something else, you can just put the question out there again. What do you notice your own reactions are here? Your own thoughts. Usually someone will start things off and others will follow more easily. I often think that one of the most important things I can do as a group facilitator is to step out of the way and become a little less central for people. Generally, the less I talk, the more other people talk, which is a good thing for group process. Something else that is interesting to think about is we as leaders or facilitators have power in a group. We can direct the flow of conversation. We can promote certain ideas by highlighting them or diminishing others by kind of shrugging them off. People who are close friends might feel more confident and comfortable saying things, while other people who don't know us as well might hold back in a group. It might be interesting to keep our own power in a group in mind as we go through this series in December. Some interesting things to ask yourself prior to a meeting is, who and what do I empower as a group leader? And just as important, why? Let me add this. If the notion of power is disturbing, that it's distributed unequally is kind of upsetting even, let me just say that that's okay. There's nothing unnatural about that. And all relationships have power dynamics to them that shift and change over time. Even Mennonite relationships. Something that might be important to do in a conversation about power is to help people define it. And one way to do that is to say that power is really just one's ability to influence others and the world around them, to affect a desired change in someone or something. Something that I might do after putting that definition out there is ask the group to identify things that increase their own power. You might highlight that a family name can influence others, like the way that Abimelech uses his mother's family name to gain influence over his kinsmen. Or wealth. After all, Abimelech uses money to hire mercenaries to kill his rivals. See what people come up with in that conversation. The question could be, what increases a person or group's influence in the world? And after people identify things that influence their power, it might be interesting to ask the group where it is in life they feel most powerful. Or another way to ask that is, where in life do they feel that they have the most influence on what happens around them? And why? The idea here that power isn't just a personal trait, it's also something that occurs in a certain context. I learned this well the time that I spent in Russia with my wife, where almost nobody spoke English. And my wife, being a fluent in Russian, had a lot more power than me. And so everything that I needed to know, she had to decode for me. And every sign that I came across, she had to read. And it really made me feel kind of powerless in the situation. You might share your own experiences like this to help things along in that conversation. Something to keep in mind is that a topic like this might be met with more silence than usual in a group. And again, it's okay and even good to allow for silence. It gives people time to think. Remember the 15-second rule. But if there seems like there's a silence that is one of hesitation, it might be interesting to just notice that aloud and maybe even wonder out loud whether there's something, as Mennonites, there's something about the idea of power and that we have power in certain situations that is uncomfortable. How do Mennonites feel about the idea that they might be powerful in certain ways? This line of questioning might lead to an interesting conversation about the type of dilemmas embedded in a conversation like this for an Anabaptist people. Traditions of pacifism and nonviolence coming into contact with questions of power and influence. Again, I think it's okay to not have an exact idea where a conversation like this might go, but it might be interesting to see where things lead, just to sort of open it up. Something else that I think might be important to talk about in a conversation like this is, how do we know that the power someone is using is being used ethically? For me, that question is similar to the question, how do we know that the power someone is using is being used in a Christian-like way? Throughout history, world leaders have claimed to do what they do because God is on their side, right? That what they do is part of God's plan. You've probably heard that before. Even if what they did was engaging in war or the subjugation of other people. So how do we, as regular modern-day human beings, know the difference between an Abimelech and a Jotham? And with that important question, I'll leave it at that. Thank you for listening, and I wish you all a fruitful conversation as you enter into this month's Salt and Light program.